You know, it's a real shame, but most of the interesting facts that people think they know about Friedrich Nietzsche's life are either outright myths or half-truths or just questionable stories with no evidence. These are what are called zombie myths, myths that have been shown to be false again and again, and yet they refuse to die. And unfortunately, there are a lot of smart people, professors, philosophers, and public intellectuals who have valuable things to say about Nietzsche that still tend to repeat these myths. And there are a number of reasons for this phenomenon. It's part of what Walter Kaufmann called the Nietzsche legend, and we'll get into these specific reasons as they apply to each particular story when we discuss them. But the main reason, I think, is that we like a good story. And any good teacher, any good orator will tend to latch on to colorful anecdotes about a philosopher's life in order to make their life and work seem more interesting. It's simply more entertaining to put forward an evocative story, even if it's unsubstantiated, and no one likes the killjoy who pops up and says, source. But that's exactly what we're going to do today, because I would argue that by propagating the Nietzsche legend, we've crafted an image around him that gives people a false impression of who he was. And oftentimes, as we'll find, many of these myths tend to portray Nietzsche in a negative light. Much of the Nietzsche legend ends up forming a basis for dismissing him. Even those who portray Nietzsche as a valuable thinker who must be contended with, people such as Jordan Peterson, they occasionally fall back on these stories as a way of implicitly delegitimizing Nietzsche. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to the particular myth that I have in mind for that one. But before we get into the list, however, we're going to talk about something else that there's a lot of confusion about, and that's data breaches. You can't really feel secure about your data unless you know for a fact that it hasn't been compromised. But when there's a data breach, it takes most companies an average of about 9 months to report that breach to the public. This is more common than you might think. Last year, Citigroup and JP Morgan Chase both had data breaches, and when Bank of America had a data breach recently, once again, the public didn't know about it for months. If being in the dark about your data being stolen sounds like something you want to avoid, then you should check out the sponsor for this video, Aura. Data brokers compile your private information and sell it to the highest bidder, all without your knowledge. Legally, they are supposed to remove it if you ask them, but they make it very hard to do. This is where Aura comes in. Aura will inform you if they find your data anywhere on the dark web, and will let you know quickly if anyone tries to use this information to try and get into your accounts. They will also do the hard work of removing your information from these data broker websites for you. Free credit monitoring after the fact, the kind of thing offered by other services. It's kind of like installing security cameras after your house was robbed. If you have Aura on your side, they'll be actively on the lookout to protect your data before anything happens. And in the worst case scenario, they offer up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. Their app provides so many features to keep you safe and informed about your data, and if you go right now to aura.com/essentialsalts, they'll even give you a free 14-day trial. Within that 14-day period, they can tell you if any of your personal data is exposed. You'll know about it before one of these companies are forced to notify you months later. So don't take any chances with your data. Don't let anyone take advantage of you because you were in the dark. Go to the sponsored link, get your free 14-day trial, and let Aura keep you in the know. And now back to the video. So, this is my list of 5 so-called facts about Nietzsche's life, but they're not all equal in how wrong they are. There are 3 which are myths, outright false. There's one for which there's just no evidence, no good reason to believe it, and then there's one that's a little bit questionable. It could be true, but I think people are way too overconfident about. So without further ado, here's the list. Number 1, Nietzsche had no friends. This is a common trope about Nietzsche, especially among those who say that his loneliness somehow led to his insanity. Jonathan B., the content creator, sort of implied this when he referred to Nietzsche as marginalized and unappreciated by the intellectuals of his time. I think he actually called him a loser. But you can also find positive versions of this myth. For example, in this YouTube video by Thinksy, in which they argue that being lonely, like Nietzsche was, as they assume, is the path to becoming the overman, or overperson, as they put it in that video. The fact of the matter is, this is plainly wrong. Nietzsche had many friendships throughout his life, some of them lifelong. In his school days, he became fast friends with the Schopenhauerian Paul Deussen. And as a philologist, he was very close with his fellow classmates Erwin Rohde and Karl von Gersdorff. In fact, Nietzsche and Rode were nicknamed the Dioscuri by Professor Friedrich Ritschl, the man who recommended Nietzsche for his position, and Nietzsche was good friends with Ritschl and his wife as well, but the meaning behind that nickname is that the two were inseparable. They were best friends. He was friends with Richard Wagner and his wife Cosima also, as well as the prominent philologist Jacob Burckhardt, all older people whom he looked up to as mentors. He also befriended many intellectual women, Helen Zimmern, Malvida von Meisenbug, Meta von Salis, and Lou Salome. Even after Nietzsche left the university and began spending most of his time in the Swiss Alps, his friends would come and visit him. He even mentions this in Ecce Homo, recounting a visit from Heinrich von Stein. And in his later years, Peter Gast, real name Heinrich Koselitz, was his editor and stenographer to some extent, and Nietzsche maintained correspondence with the theologian Franz Overbeck for his entire life. In fact, when Nietzsche collapsed in Turin in 1889, it was Overbeck who traveled there to take care of Nietzsche and bring him to the hospital. And it isn't even true that, as it is sometimes said, that no one appreciated his work, his philosophy in his own time. I mean, sure, he didn't attain the status that Schopenhauer or Hegel did in their lifetimes, but the younger Nietzsche's first book, Birth of Tragedy, was praised by Wagner, one of the most popular composers at the time. Lou Salome and Paul Ray both took Nietzsche's ideas very seriously. And they had even entertained the notion of starting a little philosophical community together, and he often spoke of wanting to make them into his philosophical disciples. Peter Gast obviously believed that Nietzsche was destined for great things, or else he wouldn't have spent hours and hours writing down Nietzsche's ideas for him and helping him to compile his work, often sacrificing his own career to do so. And the Danish philosopher Georg Brandes, as well as Helen Zimmern, became early adopters and translators of his work. Now, I know what many will say in objection to this. Well, Nietzsche had a falling out with Wagner. Their friendship ended in the late 1870s. He had a falling out with Lou Salome and Paul Ray, a heartbreaking end to their friendship in the early 1880s. That seems to have emotionally affected Nietzsche. And some of his friends, like Burckhardt, were somewhat disturbed by Nietzsche's writing. But this isn't a good argument. Even if his friendships didn't last forever, that doesn't mean he was a lonely man with no friends. I think most people experience a break or a falling out with some of our friends over the course of our lives, or sometimes you just naturally drift apart. Oftentimes, the way that some of Nietzsche's friendships ended is used as evidence that he was just on a downward spiral of self-isolation or something, when in fact, even in the late 1880s, he was still hanging out with Helen Zimmern and Meta von Salis at the Alpenrose Hotel, writing letters back and forth with Overbeck, sending Burckhardt his books, answering fan letters from Brandes. So it's true that Nietzsche's philosophy emphasized solitude, and that he spent a great deal of time alone, walking, thinking, reading, and writing. But it really should be emphasized that this was a personality issue, for one, and that he chose to do this with his life. It wasn't because nobody wanted to be friends with him. In fact, most people who knew Nietzsche seemed to like him. It's often said that he was like a charming and interesting man, and Zimmern in particular really fondly remembered her long walks with Nietzsche in Bayreuth, during which they discussed philosophy. And she wrote that he was at his best in a one-on-one conversation or in a small group of friends. When Nietzsche did seem like a fish out of water, it was at large social occasions, such as the Bayreuth Festival, which Nietzsche departed early because his headaches were flaring up, he didn't like crowds, and he especially didn't like the Wagnerians. And also in his school days, he joined a fraternity, but then he complained about the beer-drinking patriotism of his frat brothers and promptly quit. So we can see that there's this preference for not being part of a group on the part of Nietzsche, but never any shortage of friends, and friends who admired him and people who respected him intellectually. Simply put, there was never a period in Nietzsche's life when he wasn't corresponding with dozens of people, taking time out of his solitude to meet with his friends. As far as I see it, this myth is outright false. So let's move on to number 2. Nietzsche's philosophy drove him insane. This is a somewhat unusual claim if we think about it critically for 2 seconds, but it's one that, surprisingly or not, tends to be made by other philosophers. And the reason why I say it may be surprising is that it may seem weird for a philosopher to blame philosophy for causing mental health problems that might reflect poorly on philosophy as a discipline. But on the other hand, the way that many philosophers argue for the importance of their work is by suggesting that there are real-world consequences to having the wrong ideas about reality, which is why you need the right ideas about reality, aka their ideas. Among those who have said this or merely implied it, we could include Heidegger, René Girard, or Erich Heller. Many contemporary public intellectuals like to play on this trope as well when discussing Nietzsche, and I should emphasize that I like all of these writers that I've mentioned who have played on this trope. The reason why I'm prepared to call this a myth, even though it would seem to be unfalsifiable, is simply because we have conflicting evidence that points to a lifelong medical condition. And even though we can't exactly be certain what Nietzsche's condition was, it was certainly physiological in nature and almost certainly the cause of his eventual insanity. First, to look at his family history, Nietzsche's father died of a mysterious illness when he was 5 years old. A year later, his baby brother died. Nietzsche himself had migraines from the age of 9 onward. And when he was in adulthood, he began to see visual phosphenes. That is, lights and shapes that moved across his field of vision whenever he closed his eyes. And he eventually started to go blind, which, by the way, is why he retired early from the university. When he reached the 36th year of his life, the age that his own father had reached when he died, Nietzsche had one of his worst years, and he began to predict that any day could be his last. He confided to his friend, Resa Schönhofe, about the visual phosphenes, and she recounted, quote, with disturbing urgency in his soft voice, he asked, "Don't you think this is a symptom of incipient madness?" End quote. The pain from his migraines tended to be on the right side of his head, and Nietzsche's right eye eventually went almost completely blind. Whenever he was walking outside, he would carry a parasol to shield the sunlight from his eyes, because the light was incredibly painful otherwise. And part of why Nietzsche needed Peter Gast to write down his words and edit them is because he couldn't spend too much time per day straining his eyes to read and write. Thus, while Nietzsche's eventual collapse in Turin may seem to be a sudden, inexplicable event, it would seem to have been prefigured by a number of symptoms, which even Nietzsche himself suspected would eventually claim his mind or his life. As to what this condition was, some have speculated that Nietzsche had a tumor behind his right eye, whereas a more recent theory is that Nietzsche's collapse was caused by CADASIL, a heritable stroke disorder which may have also claimed his father and younger brother. I think the reason why people are enchanted by this idea, that it was actually Nietzsche's philosophy that drove him mad, has to do with the fact that it fits a certain pattern, almost a certain story trope at this point, the tendency of a brilliant but obsessive type of person to descend into madness after a genius career. We might think of the mathematician John Nash, portrayed in the film A Beautiful Mind, or Bobby Fischer, the chess world champion, who eventually exhibited erratic behavior and started to express some strange ideas. But when it comes to both of these figures, it's very hard to say that their genius is what drove them mad, or that their obsession with this certain field of study that broke open a whole new world for them or something like that actually caused their insanity. John Nash had schizophrenia. That's a condition with a physiological basis. And Fisher also likely had schizophrenia, probably Asperger's, maybe also some form of antisocial personality disorder. Now, maybe you could say on the other hand that one's genius obsession could be a product of their insanity, but that's a very different claim from the idea that Nietzsche's philosophy caused his insanity. It just seems inescapable to me that in order to accept this idea, you'd have to believe that thoughts create physiological conditions, which is ultimately a metaphysical claim, that somehow thought shapes reality. And again, in the case of schizophrenia, you can look at a brain scan and see the physical differences. So are we saying that somebody's thoughts could actually change the physical makeup of their brain to make them quote-unquote go insane? The fact of the matter is, if you were a doctor diagnosing a patient, you would never accept the explanation that someone's philosophy drove them mad, or that their obsession with chess drove them mad, for that matter. You would demand a physiological cause. So while it's a good story, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. This is a myth. Number 3, Nietzsche had syphilis. Now, I've done a whole video on this topic. The link is down below in the description, so I'm not going to spend as much time on this one. You can go watch that video if you want a comprehensive explanation of why the syphilis story is false, with plenty of citations for the claims I'm going to make. But I wanted this video to include all of the most common myths, and this is definitely one of the most repeated stories, so we have to address it again here. The reason why people say Nietzsche had syphilis is that he was unmarried, he was generally unsuccessful with women, and syphilis was a very common disease among European men at the time. It could easily be contracted at one of the many legal brothels across Europe. Now, they weren't fully legal in Germany at the time. It's a bit complicated. Basically, the long and short of it is oftentimes they existed in a kind of legal gray area where the policy wasn't really enforced. But the point is, syphilis was just so common and the means of contracting it so readily available. And then when we look at Nietzsche's symptoms, he had these headaches, he eventually went insane. These can also be symptoms of syphilis. And when Nietzsche was admitted to the hospital at Jena, the attending physician diagnosed him as a syphilitic, and most never questioned the story much beyond this. The problem is that later research has shown that this couldn't have been the case. The doctor thought Nietzsche had syphilis again because of his headaches and outlandish ideas, sudden descent into dementia. But as we've mentioned, his headaches began at age 9, and they worsened throughout his life. Nietzsche certainly didn't contract syphilis before he went through puberty at age 9, and even if he had contracted syphilis when he got older, the headaches were just a coincidence, right? Even though that takes out one of the main reasons why the doctor would have diagnosed him with syphilis. But anyway, in the pre-antibiotic era, syphilitic patients rarely lived for longer than about half a dozen years. In one series of almost 250 patients from the era, only one lasted for 10 years. The majority of the patients in the series died long before then. But Nietzsche survived 11 years after his mental collapse. And since his symptoms started well before the general collapse, the infection period would have been unheard of in the medical literature. Further, he could stick out his tongue without tremor, which is disconfirming evidence against the syphilis hypothesis. An advanced syphilitic can't do this. It's considered the sine qua non of a syphilis diagnosis. Further, Arthur Muthmann, when he examined Nietzsche's notebooks from the period of his insanity, concluded that these alone were enough to disconfirm the syphilis hypothesis. He said they were nothing like anything he'd ever seen written by a syphilitic patient. And meanwhile, the syphilis hypothesis is really undercut by what it doesn't explain. It doesn't explain his near blindness. It doesn't explain the visual phosphenes. And it doesn't explain the fact that his headaches were only on one side of the head, which does not happen with the migraines of syphilitic patients. This is why researchers have gravitated instead towards the tumor hypothesis, because perhaps the tumor was behind his right eye, or the CADASIL hypothesis, because that's a congenital stroke disorder. Perhaps there were blood clots that were concentrated behind his right side. In other words, their diagnoses actually fit the symptoms, and the syphilis hypothesis frankly does not. There are a number of things that actually make that diagnosis impossible. Now, I think what's going on with this myth is that syphilis obviously provided some sort of explanation for why Nietzsche collapsed, which is a better explanation than his philosophy drove him mad. And it was an incorrect explanation, but it has stuck because, again, it's a better story. And why? Well, because it's scandalous. It perhaps hints at a secret, lurid lifestyle. But ultimately, I think it's another way of delegitimizing Nietzsche. Oftentimes, the story is used that way, to present him as, again, a loser or something like that. The trouble is, Nietzsche's friend, Paul Deussen, has suggested that Nietzsche wasn't even comfortable going into a brothel. He recounts a story in which Nietzsche was accidentally taken to a brothel by a carriage driver when he'd asked to go to the hotel, and Nietzsche was so nervous upon walking inside, he couldn't even remember how to speak, and instead he went over and played the piano. Now, this story is hearsay. It's impossible to say whether it's true or not, but frankly, many of the stories that people base their understanding of Nietzsche's biography on are also based on hearsay. So if you want to discount hearsay, that's fine, but we're going to have to discount a lot of these myths, including the next myth that we're going to discuss. And it's funny how, based on whether people want to believe a certain story or not, they'll either become more or less rigorous in their evidentiary standards. But that's beside the point. Maybe Nietzsche did visit brothels, but he didn't have syphilis. And while the myth was perhaps more excusable in the early days of Nietzsche scholarship, in which people just took the initial diagnosis and ran with it, it's not really excusable now to repeat it, because it just indicates that you haven't paid attention to any of the medical research done since the late 1800s that, frankly, disproves this story definitively. Moving on to number 4, Nietzsche hugged a horse. And this is the first one that I'm saying is not an outright myth, but there's simply no evidence for this. The story goes that while Nietzsche was having his mental collapse, he saw a horse being beaten by a carriage driver and ran over to throw himself between the driver and the horse. In some versions of the story, he cries out, "I understand you," as he hugs the horse. But either way, after protecting the horse from being whipped, he collapses into insanity. Among those who have promoted this story are Jordan Peterson, and he likes to tie this story to a similar scene in Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, perhaps as an example of Jungian synchronicity between their lives. Now, again, the story, we don't have disconfirming evidence for it. We can't prove that it didn't happen. But once we go over the details of where the story comes from, I think it will become clear there's no good reason to think it did happen. For one, just to premise this, Nietzsche did do a lot of weird things before his mental collapse. In his final productive year, his landlord in Turin, Davide Fino, noticed a lot of strange behavior. Nietzsche apparently shredded his money and threw it in the waste bin. He took all the art off of the walls of his apartment, claiming it would make it look more like a temple. There are even stories of him dancing naked in his room. And many of his letters to his friends during this time begin to seem manic and megalomaniacal. He signs some of his letters as Dionysus, others as the Crucified. He fantasizes about executing major political figures and so on. Nietzsche's friends and his landlord were very concerned, and they wrote and talked about these strange behaviors around the time of his collapse, the time leading up to it, and the time after it. But there's no mention of the story about the horse, none contemporaneous with Nietzsche, which is strange, because it would certainly seem to be a particularly memorable event, and if they wrote all of these other things, which could certainly be embarrassing for Nietzsche's reputation, you can't really use the argument maybe they hid the horse story to protect his reputation. Why would they ignore or exclude perhaps the most remarkable and memorable story about his collapse while talking about all of these other things? So again, what is the source for the story? Well, it's from an article published in an Italian magazine some 11 years after the fact, in the year 1900, the year Nietzsche died. The article was published anonymously, and it bases its claims on unsourced hearsay. By this time, Nietzsche had gathered a considerable reputation as a philosopher, far more than he'd had when he was writing, when he was lucid, and there was a growing interest in his life and work. So we might imagine maybe a colorful story about the moment of Nietzsche's collapse would be of interest to readers. It's a nice climax for the tale, rather than in he just collapsed. And furthermore, consider the similarity to the scene in Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, sometimes held up as a kind of evidence for a synchronicity between Nietzsche's life and the writing of Dostoevsky, because, after all, both men explored nihilism and the decline of religious faith as key themes. Would seem fitting that perhaps a scene out of a Dostoevsky novel could play out in Nietzsche's own life. And yet, does it not seem more likely that the scene in the novel that was already published at this time could have instead been the inspiration for the story, rather than a coincidental parallel, especially given that the source is anonymous hearsay 11 years later, when none of Nietzsche's friends or family ever mentioned the story before then. The possibility of an inspiration from Crime and Punishment is one of the possibilities brought up by the Italian Nietzsche scholar Anacleto Verrecchia, who tried to verify this tale and couldn't find any primary sources. Now, in the interest of intellectual honesty, Verrecchia eventually talked to Davide Fino's daughter, so the daughter of Nietzsche's landlord, who was a child at the time of Nietzsche's collapse and was, by the time he spoke to her, an older woman. She was the only person who remembered this story, but she didn't say that she witnessed it. She didn't say that her father witnessed it. She said she heard her father talking about it, and that, according to her, he had heard about it from someone else. But Davide Fino himself never mentioned the story when he was alive, and by the time Verrecchia was doing his research, we should say, the story was a well-established part of the Nietzsche lore. Given the malleability of the human memory, and given that Fino's daughter is at this point a third-hand source recounting what her father said he heard about decades ago, Verrecchia was satisfied to call the story apocryphal. In other words, you have to be really credulous to just uncritically believe this story. Again, I'm not calling it an outright myth, but I'm saying there's no evidence for it. And I think because Nietzsche is such an opponent of the moral value of pity, this story appeals to a particular type of Christian or traditionalist intellectual. The kind of person who wants to portray Nietzsche's collapse as a warning not to go down the same road. It's the idea that Nietzsche's collapse is precipitated by a kind of upwelling of this unstoppable flood of pity for this poor animal. It's a very useful story if you want to say, ultimately, that Dostoevsky was correct and Nietzsche was wrong. And by the way, that's exactly Jordan Peterson's position, and he's one of the contemporary purveyors of this myth. Moving on to number 5, Nietzsche proposed to Lou Salome twice. And this is the final story that we're going to call into question here, and I should emphasize, this is the story that's merely questionable. I'm not saying that it's false. It's an interesting case because I think there has to be some truth to it, but my position on this is that people are way, way too confident about what they think they know about this incident. And I think we should be more careful in our reasoning. And writers like Walter Kaufmann and Carol Death, who are more careful about presenting the facts of Nietzsche's biography, will tend to remind their readers that this story is surrounded by, for lack of a better term, lots of unsubstantiated claims. Frankly, what we have here is a he said, she said, in which one of the parties was dead when the story came out. So what is the story? Well, Nietzsche and his two friends, Lou Salome and Paul Ray, had a falling out in the early 1880s. Many speculate it's because Nietzsche fell in love with Lou. She rejected him, she ran off with Paul, effectively choosing Paul over Nietzsche, or maybe that's how he saw it. And the common retelling of the story is that Nietzsche proposed to Lou twice, once through Paul Ray and another time himself, and that she rejected him both times. Now we have to ask, where does this story come from? And the original source is Lou Salome, but long after Nietzsche is dead. Lou Salome is a rather interesting figure. She knew many of the great minds of Europe during her life. Nietzsche is not the only famous person that she says fell for her. And perhaps she's telling the truth about this. She was a remarkable person. It's believable to me that lots of people were perhaps falling in love with her. But when we look at what Nietzsche says about Lou in his letters and to her, it seems that he's more interested in Lou becoming a kind of philosophical disciple, as I mentioned. He oftentimes emphasizes their intellectual kinship in these letters, rather than romance. And even though he was furious when she and Ray ran off together, there are a number of other reasons why this could be. I mean, the three were very close friends, and they were kind of forming this very tight-knit circle. They'd talked about founding a philosophical community. And Nietzsche and Paul Ray had spent some time at Malvita Meisenbug's house in northern Italy, and Meisenbug would have intellectuals come and stay with her so that they could all work and interact in the same space, and I think that idea was very appealing to both of them. And so I think it's possible it was a different kind of falling out. It's not unusual when two members of a friend group start dating, suddenly they begin spending all their time together, the other friends feel neglected, especially if it's just 3 friends and then 2 of them get together, leaving the third one as a third wheel. That can be painful, even if there aren't any competing romantic feelings. But it is very possible that Nietzsche did have feelings for Lou. The problem is that to really know this for sure, we'd have to get into his head, which we can't do. So instead, we're speculating about how he really felt on the inside, whereas we don't really have direct evidence from him anyway, where, Nietzsche writes a letter to Lou declaring his love for her or anything like that. What we do have are a number of letters from his sister Elizabeth, who was very uncomfortable with Nietzsche, Ray, and Salome's friendship and all the time they were spending together. And it seems that she believed they had some sort of love triangle or maybe even like a 3-way relationship, scandalous in the 1800s. And I think Elizabeth's imagination was just running wild. She was very protective of her brother, and Nietzsche was furious at her for interjecting herself into his affairs. But again, this doesn't prove that he had romantic feelings for Lou Salome. He might have been angry because he didn't have those feelings. He didn't appreciate his sister's insinuations. So it's complicated, and the bottom line for me is that we're trying to reconstruct how someone felt about someone else 150 years later based on letters and later recollections after the fact, all of which are incomplete because a lot of this probably took place on a personal level of personal interactions, and there's probably just no record of a lot of it. It's pretty much impossible to make these determinations. And that's why I focused on the concrete claim that Nietzsche proposed to Lou Salome twice. And I'm calling that questionable because it comes from one of the interested parties, Lou Salome, who's writing retrospectively about her life a long time later. And it's not uncommon in people's autobiographies when they include colorful stories about famous people they knew. It's not unusual at all for those famous people to challenge or dispute the things that other people write about them in their autobiographies, especially if it's embarrassing. And you can't do that when you're dead, for obvious reasons. So we kind of have to take Lou Salome's word for it that this happened. And again, it's totally possible, but it's not enough evidence for me. If that's enough for you, cool. As for myself, I'm agnostic on this one. And so that's my argument for why everything you know about Nietzsche is wrong, which is obviously an overstatement. And if that kind of thing shocks you, well, welcome to YouTube. I don't know what else to say there. And as a final word, I do want to preempt a certain response to this video that I'm anticipating. Something along the lines of, yeah, you may be right, but the myths are a better story. It's more interesting. Maybe we should hold on to the Nietzsche legend anyway, even if it isn't true. But so many of the aspects of the Nietzsche legend, it seems to me, persist as a way of disparaging him, making him easier to dismiss. Personally, I wouldn't miss any of these myths if they disappeared from the public consciousness tomorrow. And furthermore, by focusing on these dubious tales, we ignore far more interesting aspects of Nietzsche's life. Nietzsche's falling out with Richard Wagner is far more interesting than his falling out with Lou Salome. It actually has real consequences for his philosophical ideas. Nietzsche writes extensively about his problems with Wagner, Nietzsche's illness and his struggle to find a philosophy that affirms life and affirms nature, even as he suffered greatly throughout his natural life, makes him a remarkable figure in philosophy. And the mental image, that we could create of Nietzsche walking the streets on a sunny day with a parasol, the image of him shredding his money, turning his apartment into a temple, that's at least as evocative and colorful a portrait of Nietzsche, the man, as that tired old horse-hugging story that we have no evidence for. So whether you agree with his philosophy or not, no one's served by creating this fake picture of him based on rumors and hearsay. In my view, it's time to move on from the Nietzsche legend. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.